All right. So if you haven't met me, my guess is you've probably met me at this point, but my name is Shri, and this presentation is titled Writing a Planless Affirmative. This particular presentation is going to be a little bit more interactive. So usually when I give a set of lectures, it tends to be me talking at you. For this one, I'm going to have some brief thoughts, and then I sort of want to talk about the ideas that you might have for the next year and how you might optimize them so that they might win more debates. Just as sort of an initial background, for me, I spent the last 10-ish years writing, coaching, and strategizing planless affirmatives. I've definitely written a set of planless affirmatives for smaller schools. So before I moved to North Broward, which is not a small school, I mostly worked at Thomas Jefferson and Broad Run in Virginia, and mostly sort of worked on a set of planless affirmatives that had to do with postmodern theory and settler colonialism. And then in North Broward, I'm the primary argument coach for a number of teams that have read planless affirmatives across the number of years. I want to sort of start with, why write a planless affirmative and what might be some of the rationales, why you might not write a planless affirmative, and then sort of 3 methods of planless affirmative construction and sort of what not to do, what to do, and checklists. And that's sort of what I'll start with. And the second part of this will be more interactive. You can pitch me some of your ideas. I can tell you whether or not I think they might be good ideas, and then talk about sort of how you might optimize some of that stuff. So why do people write planless affirmatives? I think there's essentially sort of 3 main reasons. One is a primarily strategic one, which is that people are terrible at answering planless affirmatives. Usually, you can corner a set of strategies that people are likely to read. So the people who don't really understand the critique are only really able to, come up with a couple of strategies. Generally speaking, those strategies on all of the topics are topicality of some variety, and then a capitalism critique. There might be some other, arguments. So like there might be a team, for example, I know Kincaid likes to read psychoanalysis every year. So it's like, they might read T in psychoanalysis instead of T in cap. And then that's pretty much it. So like teams are terrible. So, it makes sense to specialize in being able to write a set of planless affirmatives. Second, I think it's a good idea, especially on this topic, if you're more of a policy and traditional minded person, to have a planless affirmative as a backup solution. So there might be a couple of debates in which there are teams that are better than you, for example, debating some process counterplans. This is probably the way to avoid a lot of the process counterplan debates. So you might pick a couple of debates where you're like, I don't feel super prepared to debate like whatever thing that they've broken on their wiki. Maybe I need to fall back on a set of critical options. And then lastly, this is sort of a less of a strategic concern, but more just, you find some theory or a certain social justice concern interesting, and thus you think you want to sort of read the set of arguments. So, over the number of years, I've definitely coached a couple of teams that, felt very strongly about their set of arguments. So, just this past year, I coached a student, Anna Farinay, who is an indigenous woman and is very interested in a set of settler colonialism arguments, and I spoke to her personally. And the reason why, you might sort of decide some of your strategies that way is that oftentimes you sound more persuasive when you're actually persuaded, right? So, the more it's sort of like near and dear to you, or, at the very least interesting to you, it's more likely that you'll do the best debating that you'll do. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how you might write a planless affirmative. And this comes with a couple of caveats that sort of I've learned across the years, both sort of mistakes that I've made and things that worked out pretty well. And I think there's 3 sort of main ways that planless affirmatives are constructed. The first way is to start with a familiar theory and then think about its relationship to the curriculum surrounding the topic. So the first way is start with a familiar theory and then think about its relationship to the curriculum surrounding the topic. So for example, let's say that you're already very interested in a field like Afro-pessimism, right? You might start with a set of works and then do a couple of Google searches. Usually Google Scholar searches are the places that you want to start. You might include like the phrase Afro-pessimism and criminal justice reform and find a set of cards essentially that critique sort of the curricula that surround the topic. I imagine, there will be a number of affirmatives next year that will start from an Afro-pessimist assumption that debating things like criminal justice reform and abolition is sort of the wrong starting point, and that we need to sort of understand anti-Blackness more structurally. So that's one way to do it. There's some pros and cons to this method of affirmative construction. The pro is that you probably, if you're starting with a familiar theory, you're, well, familiar. So you don't have to do a lot of the infrastructural work, right? So it might cut out some of that work, but, it'll allow you to very quickly get into very sophisticated sets of literature. And this makes sense, if you already have kind of an idea of an affirmative that you want to break, and then to find a set of, articles that coincide with that idea. A big con of this model is that you oftentimes don't get to the best articles on the topic. So, you might think, for example, you're like, oh, I'm really good at, explaining Afro-pessimism. Well, it might be the case that the best articles on the topic are not Afro-pessimist in nature. There might have been a couple of articles that you missed because of that very narrow tailoring. I think that sort of the start with a familiar theory and then think about the topic version is a way to write quickly write affirmatives. So if you don't have too much time before a tournament, it's like that's a way to quickly put together a planless affirmative. Or if you're like, this is an example actually from a debate tournament that I was at. At the New Trier tournament, North Broward MR was debating MBA, Barton, and Haberman. And after that debate, we were going to debate another MBA team. We had sort of come to the conclusion that was like, it would not be great if, we debated MBA team 1, they got all of our framework answers, and then MBA team 2 basically wrote out everything. So I spent about 2 hours writing a new affirmative from the presupposition that was like, okay, so I'm pretty good at like finding a set of articles about, so we usually read race arguments. I was like, I know that there's probably a set of arguments about queer theory and immigration. So I did the quick search, found a bunch of articles, and that was a 1AC. And we created a new 2AC, and that was it. So like that set of affirmatives tends to be a lot quicker to write because you're like, you already kind of know what you need. It's just like you need the cards that are about the topic mechanism. The second method of planless affirmative construction is a lot more team and genre specific. It's team and genre specific. What I mean by that is instead of starting with a 1AC or starting with ideas like, okay, this is my theory and I'm going to answer CJR, instead you should start with the 2AC. So you should be like, here are the 2AC arguments that I'd like to make against framework, and then you then want to transpose and find the CJR area that best corresponds. A couple of examples. One example of an affirmative that we wrote this way was there's like a race war based affirmative that Wake had broken that we had read in the quarters of the TOC. And we had not decided immediately that we wanted to talk about the race war. So we didn't start with the familiar theory of the race war and then find a set of cards about immigration. We were like, this Highland Park team that we're going to debate really likes to make a set of skills arguments on framework. And we were like, what do I think are the best sets of impact trends against skills? I was like, okay, well, perhaps a set of arguments that's inaccessible, maybe that the set of skills that you learn are bad because they're, skills about sort of like how to improve government processes. And then I was like, okay, what AF fits the most given that framework argument? And then I was like, so we worked backwards from the 2AC to be like, oh, yeah, what would be good? Like a AF that would be a lot more militant, like the race war affirmative. And so we lifted some of the cards from Wake and we're like, here's the AF that we're writing. The strategic process in that case is a little bit different, right? I didn't start with 1AC. I'm not like, here are some ideas that interest me about CJR. I was like, I want a thing that answers this particular team's framework argument, and then I work backwards. Another example from the TOC. I'm not sure if you've watched the TOC finals from 2019. When we're debating MBA, we knew that we basically had their framework block after about, 8 months of competing, word for word. Like, I literally asked George to transcribe every word of every argument that was made in the 2C and the 2NR after we had taped it. Then I was like, okay, so these are the things that are likely to be said. What do I think would be sort of a best strategic approach against this framework argument? And we kind of concluded the best way might be to make a set of we meet arguments. Like Aiden was very good at making clash arguments, but not very good at sort of the violation component of topicality, which is what we learned from watching a bunch of tape. And then we were like, okay, what do we think fits the most with this? And then that sort of produced the larger affirmative about federated blackness, some of the Martino evidence, and Afrofuturism. So, that's a much less sort of organic approach. So you're not starting with, this is my theory, but I'm like, strategically, what is the thing I want to write? There's a couple of other examples of this. So, if you debate a team that's explicitly talking about Afro-pessimism, you might be like, what are the best AF cards on Afro-pessimism, and what perspective might they have? So it's like, if you think the best Afro-pessimism answers are from Derrida, it's like, okay, now let me write an affirmative that's about Derrida and CJR, right? It's like you want to sort of get to that final conclusion from that 2AC itself. The third sort of way to write a planless affirmative is a lot more chaotic. It's a deep dive into the topic. Deep dive into the topic. This is basically when you're looking for new ideas or new affirmatives that have basically ideas that are not already hashed out in debates, that they're not so predictable. Like one sort of area that I found that I think nobody has been basically doing work on is Deleuze's postscript on control societies. So he writes a set of, most of what you think of when you think of Deleuze, I guess, is you probably think of, rhizomes and maybe like not having trees and having roots and, stuff that's largely irrelevant. Deleuze actually has this section where he talks about the prison system and sort of how it has transitioned from one that is based in sort of a physical infrastructure to one that is more immaterial, based on surveillance, based on sort of a set of control societies that actively induces you to be sort of a good, responsible model for civil institutions, and makes a set of sort of arguments about the shift in prisons. And it's like that, exploring that literature, although people have not really done that, might be fruitful for a new affirmative that people tend not to have very many answers to. Or their answers to will be like, A.T. Deleuze, nomadism is bad, and you'll be like, that had nothing to do with the app. Right? It's like, so, that deep dive version is sort of your long-term project that's like, I'm trying to look for things that could be interesting that people have not come up with that allow you to create sort of a new base for an affirmative. Okay, so we talked a little bit about sort of the methods and approaches to plan this affirmative construction. I sort of want to briefly talk about what not to do. And these are sort of traps that I've come across in my sort of mistakes in writing planless affirmatives, and I've also seen in a bunch of other teams. So a couple of things under what not to do. One, it can't just be a state bad argument. It can't just be a state bad argument. It also cannot just be a critique of CJR. So you can't just be like, I took a negative file and I put it on the F, right? The problem with that approach is that will immediately lose to topicality against anyone who is competent, because they'll just be like, oh, so you're saying CJR is bad? So that sounds like a negative argument. So you could say that in a negative. And the F will say that CJR is good. Right? That's not really a winning strategy. The other reason why you don't want it to just be a K of CJR is because teams are actually prepared, weirdly enough, right? Because most of the teams that are reading plans have cut a bunch of cards that say we should reform CJR on the affirmative. So if your premise of the 1AC is CJR is bad, you're about to get obliterated by someone's AF when they read it on the 1C. This is something that I think a lot of negative teams don't do, which I think they should start doing. Because it's like, if they have such a strong claim that's like, our AF is never compatible with CJR, it's very easy to be like, oh, well, I have a whole locked out affirmative that has a bunch of cards in offense that seems to be offense against this AF. Instead, you want to make sure that instead of it being state bad or critique CJR, you need a sort of an argument that says that debates or switch side curriculum over CJR is bad. I'll repeat that again. So instead of state bad or CJR bad, it needs to say debating about and switching sides over a curriculum of CJR is bad. The sort of big difference between the two is it can't just be a card that's like CJR is ineffective or CJR is racist. It needs to be a card that says something like the debates that happen over the pros and cons of CJR are not a good place to start. That we should not be switching sides over questions of, for example, if I was Afro-pessimist, I'd be like, we should not be switching sides over questions of anti-Blackness. We should certainly not have debate curricula that's centered around the pros and cons of policy altogether, right? So it's not just CJR is bad, but just the whole group of debates over CJR is bad. We should not even have the Afro-pessimism debates where the Afro debates CJR are good, right? It's like the whole point is we should have sort of an ethical, paradigmatic approach that's like all these debates are bad. So a card like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be pessimistic though, right? There might be a set of critique authors that are just like, maybe the way that sort of the limits are constructed in these debates is bad. So limiting policing to only being law enforcement activity. Perhaps that is a bad approach for debates curriculum, affirmative and negative. It should not just be AFNEG, law enforcement racial profiling. It might be AFNEG on a broader set of questions of policing that matters. For example, I can imagine a set of affirmatives that say something like, we should think of policing as sort of a larger set of societal control, that is a larger form of societal control that, just looking at these sort of technical debates over should we have qualified immunity does not approach. George Zimmerman, for example, was not a police officer. So maybe just restricting these debates altogether to just, is law enforcement doing a good job or are people with badges doing a good job is sort of a bad way to approach the topic. Hopefully that sort of distinction doesn't seem just semantic, but has some content, right? It's like these debates are bad, not just CGR and state is bad. The second, what not to do. This one I think might be a little bit counterintuitive and maybe the opposite of what people have suggested. And this is sort of a minority opinion. Your AF should not be abolition. Your affirmative should not be abolition. You should not fall into this trap. This is stupid. And this is what policy people think AF should be. Because they think that if the AF is abolition, they can read all negative arguments, right? It'll get obliterated by anyone reading a CGR AF, everyone's abolition answers, topicality, and every off-case argument. That just sounds like losing. It does not make any sense. You want to sort of stray away from that and have sort of a larger, if you're writing a critical AF, it makes more sense strategically to be like, we think curricula about sort of abolition in CGR are kind of a mistake and they need to be a lot more expansive. That's why I sort of started with the Afro-pessimism discussion a little above, right? Because Afro-pessimism, like that Woods article that I keep talking about and the Afro-pessimism lecture, like a long, long time ago, is like, if abolition is the answer, what is the question? It's like, that's essentially the approach that you want to take to the T debates and other stuff. It's like CJR and abolition are the wrong answers and they're not asking the right questions. And these are the questions that need to be asked instead. I can't stress enough that like this abolition, good strategy of critical affirmatives will just get posed immediately. Like imagine this, it's like you read the abolition good AF or you read an AF that functionally ends up in abolition. Then the 1 in C says T CJR combined with T USFG with a set of extra T arguments. Probably a cap K because that's what they're trained to go for. A set of ballot arguments. I would also probably add in a set of cards. It's like we should have white collar crime, have mandatory minimums. So I would read a set of arguments. It's like we should increase sentencing for some people. That's based on extinction. And then I would have also a set of things that's just like we should also increase things like mandatory minimums on like things like sex crimes. But it's like that sounds like an awful 1 in C to debate. You can't no link any of that. You have to debate all of it. What a terrible idea. Do not read that as a strategic. That is not strategic as an affirmative. It should not be, and then last thing for what not to do. I think this is also an area where K-teams sort of make a mistake, which is that you should not read the same affirmative in every debate. You should not just have the same AF for the whole tournament. You should evaluate what kind of critical affirmative you're reading based on the flexibility of teams. I'd say as a whole, negative teams against planless AFs tend to be inflexible, right? They'll always have some kind of generic that they're relying on, whether that be topicality. And I don't just mean people who are very policy-minded, even K people are this way too, right? So if you ask like some of my critical teams what their negative strategies against K affirmatives are, they're likely to be like, okay, there are a couple of generics I really like maybe I really like cat, or maybe I really like talking about Baudrillard. It's like that is their thing. So it's a lot easier to sort of track what generics teams tend to like to read against planless AFs. And that means that you should have a couple of different critical affirmatives in store that answer each one of those perspectives the best. The K-AF that answers T might not be the best AF against cat. The K-AF that answers psychoanalysis might not be the best AF against T, right? Having a set of these different kinds of critical affirmatives and planless affirmatives for different situations is sort of the best way to approach it. And in particular, I'd say, one way that we sort of prepared for the TOC as a school is we tried to write different affirmatives for different kinds of 2NRs that exist. So we took like approach 2 for planless affirmative construction. We're like, what are the best authors that might answer psychoanalysis? And I was like, okay, it might be a set of like Deleuzians who are writing from the perspective of blackness. That's the AF against this team. Or this team likes to really go for skills-based arguments and movement lawyering. Who do I think has the best critique of movement lawyering? And then it's like, all right, what is the AF, right? And like tracking and having a different kind of affirmative like that makes it very difficult and slippery to really approach and respond to. So that's sort of like my what not to do combined with what to do. Make sense? Lastly, I kind of want to go over a couple of checklists of arguments that you need to answer for a planless affirmative to be effective. And after that checklist, I'd be happy to, for you to just be more interactive, you to pitch some ideas, me to tell you, what needs to happen for those ideas to work, etc. Or any questions you might have about sort of planless affirmative execution. First checklist. You should have sort of a set of case overviews that relate to your affirmative. what should be in those case overviews? Well, they should not just be general explanations of the affirmative. This is generally a mistake that I think a lot of people who are young who are writing these set of critical affirmatives do. So it'll just be like, let's say the 1AC is about Baudrillard, and the 2AC is just like, here's my big rant about Baudrillard and explaining terms. It's like, no, that's a complete waste of time. Generally speaking, your 2AC overview, et cetera, case overviews should not be more than 30 seconds. That's sort of thing one. And thing two is that you should have sort of a large thematic element that answers all off-case positions that you're planning to, answer. So for example, let's say that you're, this is sort of something that I saw from North Star that was very effective. They had a set of overview arguments that were just like, what's important is sort of the need for a survival strategy, and to attempt to suggest that Black women should not have certain survival strategies is something that non-Black women should not be able to tell us, right? That sort of central claim is something that obviously affects things like capitalism, Baudrillard. It might even affect sort of the way that you might debate T-skills arguments, right? And it's like having sort of a central one argument like that applies across the board in the case overview is something that is very effective. So you don't want it to be like, here's my rote explanation of this is the mechanism. Here are some of the words. Here's the solvency. No. You want like one offensive argument that you're going to explain in about 30 seconds that, applies across the board to a bunch of different things. If it's Baudrillard, it might be a set of arguments about how information is dissuasive. And you might have an application of that argument to every portion of the flow, right? As opposed to being like, here's my thoughts about Baudrillard that no one really cared to flow at all. Other sort of things that need to be in the 2AC checklist. Your 2AC to T needs to be diverse. You cannot have one block that says 2AC to topicality. The reason is because people are starting to innovate a little bit with regards to topicality arguments and standards, right? Not all T arguments are about fairness, although I'd say the best ones are, for my own personal opinion. There are definitely T arguments that are based in learning things like movement learning or legal skills. There are topicality arguments that have more racial inflection, that are like, we need to learn things like racial realism or racial, skills related to sort of movement building. There might be a set of T arguments that are based on ideas of Black stasis. This is like a set of arguments that Rashad Evans had written in a set of blog posts. You have to have sort of a modularized set of 2ACT arguments that have answers to sort of each component, instead of having a 2AC to T that's just like, I read this against all T arguments. So I would create a block that's like 2AC T general, that has your counter interpretation and whatever your interpretation is of debate. So you know how usually at the top of 2 and CT arguments, they're like, debate is a game, it's a competition, we have two sides, people are flowing, blah, blah. It's like, you need to have some, counter interpretation of how debates should work. So perhaps debate is not simply a competition. Its pedagogical element might come first, or perhaps debate is not a competition at all, but it's maybe a set of skills building exercises. Whatever it is you're going to say about it, it's like you should have a top level frame that's like, this is what I think debate as a competition should be, and then a counter interpretation of either the words in the resolution or the role of the affirmative. Then you should have sort of modular blocks that are like 2AC AT fairness, for example, and then you might have a set of arguments, or 2AC answers to clash and iterative testing. You might have a set of blocks to that, and sort of write out sort of the 2 ACs to each one of those things. Okay, so that's T. Next sort of things that you want a checklist for is you want a set of answers to very common critiques that people like to read. And you don't want sort of the same 2 AC for all of them. So let's pick one area that's very common, capitalism. People read the capitalism critique, right? Usually CapKs don't just sort of fit in one boat. And I think a lot of teams lose because they think that CapK is the same every debate. The CapK is not just, for example, we should focus not on race but on class, right? There's a bunch of different versions of the capitalism critique. There are some versions that will focus on your state phobia. So they might be like, the problem with sort of your critique is that it hates the state and we need the state to regulate markets, right? There might be a version that's less about the state and more about sort of the need to focus on materialism as opposed to language or the labor focus. There are also versions of capitalism nowadays that I've seen, and I think Wake has been the team that is largely popularized this, is focused on things like Black Marxism. So different kinds of Marxisms within different traditions that are able to sort of avoid the best critiques of Marxism while still maintaining sort of the idea that we need materialism and collective institutions as opposed to individual rebellions. And that means that you need sort of two ACs, not just two AC cap, but again, I would be like two AC cap general. I might have my permutation and like a card that I like to read about capitalism in the F. And then I would have blocks that are like two AC AT state phobia, two AC AT labor focus, two AC AT black marks, to answer the like different kinds of ways that people will, cast these sort of two AC arguments. Similar thought about, critiques, the postmodern critiques of critical affirmatives. There tend to be a number of them. A couple of them are recycled pretty regularly each year, right? So the Academy K is probably one that you've heard of if you've debated a set of planless affirmatives or arguments about commodification, right? You might have sort of different 2AC building blocks for each one of those things. And one thing that you want to sort of remember is a lot of times postmodern critiques, so let's say I read the Baudrillard critique against the critical affirmative, right? There's a whole slew of arguments that might be about Baudrillard, might not be about Baudrillard, that might be made and might not be made, right? So you shouldn't have sort of a standard, this is my 2AC Baudrillard, I read against all Baudrillard. It should be more modularized to like 2AC answers to the university is always bad. 2AC answers to information can never persuade anyone. 2AC answers to charity cannibalism, right? And have sort of different modules that then before the debate or during your 2AC prep, you put together all the modules to create sort of a coherent critique answer, as opposed to having just like AT GJEC. It's like that doesn't really do a whole lot for anybody, because it's like my guess is that K is not just GJEC cards. It's probably like GJEC and Baudrillard and stuff and other things, and also maybe not all GJEC, and maybe only the psychoanalysis parts and not the capitalist parts of GJEC. Who knows, right? But it's like there's a bunch of different things that you're going to combine together to put together a 2AC. That's kind of the way that I think about sort of this checklist. A couple of other things should go in this checklist. There are some dumb arguments that come up year after year. Word picks are usually the ones that if you ask me or Carmen, we love those. You don't really need to engage the affirmative at all. We just think something bad about a word existed, and it solves all the answers. So it's like you need an answer to what happens when they just pick out of one word that they didn't like and then they go for it. You should have sort of a set of two ACs that are about sort of the relationship between CJR and the state. I think this year in particular, you'll hear a lot of teams, for example, try to read their affirmative as a negative strategy against a set of critical Fs. So, obviously if your affirmative is like, we should never have debates over CJR, the argument that, perhaps we should debate about CJR, in particular the affirmative, are competitive, right, by sort of definition. So, you should make sure that you have sort of a core set of things that you're going to say about why sort of debating CJR in general is kind of a bad thing. And then sort of like essentially put together a set of blocks that's like, this style of debating is not good. That you can sort of shotgun, and then you can do the rest of this specific debating against certain things. Like, for example, let's say an affirmative was like, we should reduce 1033. It's like you should have a set of, hopefully you're also reading a set of critique arguments on the negative, so you have a couple of link arguments to specific Fs that people might just read on the negative, right? And that's essentially sort of what I would say would make a complete file. And then the only other thing I would consider is just, are there off-case positions that people in your area like to read, or that are in your district that like to read that are a little bit different? So I know like anthro used to be kind of a thing like 5 years ago, and nowadays people don't really like anthro because it's just not a winning argument and very persuasive, and people have just not done any updates, right? If there's a team that likes to read an anthro argument, you should have a 2AC to anthro. Or if somebody in your region likes to really read those like James resilience cards, it's like it's time to cut a couple of cards. It's like resilience is both inevitable and good, right? It's like cutting some of those answers that for sure you're going to debate are sort of part of that checklist too. And then the upkeep of your file. The more you go further into the season, the more 2AC blocks should populate your file, right? So the more you debate to a set of teams, my guess is the breakdown will be about 60% of your debates will be about topicality, and about 40% of your debates will be about everything else. The more you see that everything else, the more you can write a set of 2AC blocks that are just added to the file into sort of a large compilation that, then sort of ultimately by the end of the year is a very, very complete file against a bunch of different kinds of strategies. And that's sort of the way that, I like to teach to write a critical F and how I write critical Fs myself. There are some situations, the only, caveat that I'm going to include before I pass it off to sort of the interactive side of things, is sometimes you might not write a fully complete 2AC file for critiques. So to give that MBA example where I was like given 2 hours to write a new affirmative so we can break against them, and, in that case, I was like, well, the only thing they know how to go for is topicality. So I feel pretty good about writing a 1AC, a 2AC to T, and a 2AC to cap and calling it a day. It was not complete. Like if they had been like, oh, it's time for psychoanalysis, we would have probably just lost. But, we sort of bet and gambled on the idea that they might have, right? And so that might be sort of a set of things that you do, especially for elim debates where you're like, okay, I have like time off to do a little bit of work. What is sort of the way to maximize my new affirmative? You might create a set of 2AC files and based on a checklist that's a lot smaller that you can crank out. And really, you should think about it like most 2Ns are going to go for the 2N position. Like most negative teams against critique apps are very inflexible. Like the 1NR is mostly worthless because the 1N has not been thinking about your critical app. They've been thinking about how to optimize their app, like the 2AC and the 2AR. And the 2N has like vaguely thought about critical affirmatives probably. They have a strategy they always like to read, but then beyond that, they're screwed. Like if you give them the 1NR position, they're done. So, that means that you should sort of study based on the wiki and what they've done in the past, what has been done in the 2 and C and 2 and R, and then be like, okay, these are the bare minimum number of blocks I need to write. This is the set of arguments the neg likes to take. Here's what I'm going to write out. Does that make sense to everybody? Anybody have any questions? I know that was kind of a bunch of information that I ranted about for a while.
Wait, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. 2 things. One is, how do we effectively mix philosophies so that we can have a coherent 1AC? So usually when I've lost to critical AFs, they've had like Baudrillard and Chiron and Deleuze in the same 1AC, and then they'll just go for whatever you drop. How do you do that effectively?
Good question. I think the goal should be, I think one thing that K teams get wrong is that debate is not really about philosophical integrity. I know that sounds very bad, but it really isn't, right? Ultimately, debate is about making a set of persuasive arguments to a judge that are related to the topic. So, if that means that you're picking a couple of philosophies that might disagree on certain details but not others, it doesn't necessarily destroy the app. So like, yeah, Baudrillard and Deleuze actually have quite a few disagreements. Baudrillard was like, forget Foucault, and Deleuze, who loves Foucault, was like, this is terrible. That being said, it's like most of the time, if you're reading topicality, it's like the Foucault and Deleuze and Baudrillard all disagree with each other cannot matter less for a debate, right? It's like, yes, I guess so. And is sort of the conclusion of that. And so the goal should be, when thinking about this, it should be like, am I making sort of a consistent argument about the way that we should do CJR curriculum? Is sort of the thing that it needs to answer. And then it's like, okay, I have some different criticisms from different people that I've collected together to suggest that this is bad. So, for example, let's take an affirmative that is focused on the problems of CJR because they don't focus on sort of the larger plantation that is America. It's like, okay, I might have a set of authors that kind of disagree about different perspectives. Like, not all Afrofuturists would have a lot of, traction with Afro-pessimists. But it might also be true that the set of arguments they're making about the CJR area are largely compatible. And you've picked an alternative that is sort of somewhere in the middle that doesn't quite, bite some of the link arguments or contradictions, and yet sort of lets you get through. For the AF, my suggestion when people mix philosophies is not to think about them as philosophies. So, it doesn't make sense to be like, okay, so I'm debating a Deleuze and Baudrillard AF. So I have 1 NC to Baudrillard and then 1 NC to Deleuze. And they'll say something like, it's not our Deleuze, it's not our Baudrillard, and it's just like totally worthless. Instead, you should be like, okay, so what is the argument that they're trying to make ultimately? And what are the things that I'm going to say about that particular argument? And if you approach it that way, you'll have a lot more success answering those types of problems. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, it does. And my second question is, how do you make high theory not sound like incoherent words that these authors made up?
Also a fair question. Again, I think the thing is trying to connect those high theory words to concepts that are arguments, right? So, I think this is like most readily seen in like psychoanalysis debates where people in the 2NC overview will just be like, the world is shaped by desire, desire is lack, and this is the superego and the id, and it's just like, no, that's doing nothing for anybody. Mostly board, judge, and teams are like, what's going on? Instead, you want to sort of make sure that those sort of words are used in conjunction with a set of arguments about CJR, and that you are using a set of examples, whether it be current events, history, popular culture, that really animate and give life to some of the terms that you're using, right? So some of the big terms that are being used, they only have value insofar as the judge sort of remembers those terms and associates them with a set of concepts that they can readily understand. So, going back to a judge and being like, hey, like they dropped like the hyperreal simulation pataphysics arguments, like they don't know what that is. Unless it's been related to a certain set of arguments about CJR with an example. And then they could be like, oh yeah, you dropped this example, which illustrates this larger argument, right? And that's sort of the way that you want to sort of think about your overviews and arguments, and generally speaking, when you're debating philosophy arguments. Ultimately, it's just a matter of, you've read a lot more than your judges have and your competitors have. And that means it's a challenge to sort of move away from the vocabulary and jargon you already have. And the way to do it is really to try to attach it to some concrete examples that people can latch onto.
So then how do you contextualize things like the body without organs, or the hyperreal, or like any or psychoanalysis terms that don't have very concrete examples?
Well, I think if they
Just
don't have,
it's just like knowing how they apply to the real world.
Yeah, like if they don't have concrete examples, they're not usually winners, right? So, like for example, let's say that you're reading the Spogiard argument against a set of race arguments. It's like when they ask the inevitable question, it's like, what does your thing do about racism? And you're like, we bodies have organed it. It's like, no, it's not going to win a debate, right? It has to be sort of, you have to have thought through what your examples are in advance, so that you're like, okay, I have some connection. Because otherwise, they're just theory words that don't quite help you with the persuasion element of debates. So I think that's it's a litmus test. I know it's sort of frustrating in some ways, but that is kind of what it is, right? It's like most judges are not willing to hear just like buzzword city. They need that buzzwords to be connected to a set of arguments.
Thank you.
Yep.
How do you think we should deal with kind of more identity arguments on the AF? For instance, I have a partner who's really excited about kind of bringing their specific identity into a debate round, but I'm the 2A. And so I just kind of want to hear what you think about that and how to best approach that.
I think it's a constant negotiation. Like, yeah, the 2A is the captain of the AF ship, but a lot of critical AFs and planless affirmatives are birthed from discussions that you have with your partner. So I'd say like some of the best ideas that I've had have been so in college, have been at the dinner table basically with my debate partner, just like talking through ideas and things like that. And sort of like, you want to find something that both of you are sort of invested in researching and understanding. If it's an issue of sort of, perhaps so let's give a sort of more concrete example. Let's say that, perhaps you're not Black and you're debating with a Black debater, and there's a set of issues that you'd like to discuss about race. It's like, yeah, definitely consideration of how you're going to approach that is pretty important. That being said, I don't think that, for example, not even Afro-pessimists are, willing to say that, no non-Black scholars should talk about pessimism. Like, that's just like factually incorrect. Like, Wilderson, Sexton have white and non-Black students attend their courses, and there's plenty of students who go through sort of that curricula. But there are sort of ways that those authors say that, for example, white people should approach race literature, right? So to discuss anti-Blackness, perhaps you must surrender to a set of assumptions that are important, that we should not sort of defend sort of a notion of identity politics where we possess certain identities or appropriate certain identities, right? So reading through and, really sort of figuring out how you fit into the larger sort of, area of research is something that'll help you quite a bit. I think a good example of this, even from just my personal experience, is, coaching Nick and George in North Broward. It's like George was Black, Nick was white, he was the 2A. It's like they obviously had to have conversations about, the set of arguments that they're making, how Nick, for example, would fit into some of the descriptions that they're, giving, what is the defense of it, and one of the ways to sort of think about it is you want to sort of approach the, those politics and situations with a lot of humility, So, if you're sort of a white individual or non-black individual talking about, anti-blackness, or if you're a non-indigenous scholar talking about settler colonialism, it's obviously important to sort of think about, how you might responsibly engage that literature and sort of, describe your relationship to it and how you might explain that argument, as opposed to just being like, here's the sort of like one person has written the AF, I'm going to give the 2AC, which tends to be a lot less persuasive.
When going through the process of like finding AFs that answer the neg generics like framework, like the second strategy for writing AFs, what is like your process to find those arguments? For example, like the TOC example, like how did y'all come up with the idea to read like all black everything? And then like how would you do that process for like a team that like is super reliant on like going for procedural fairness, for example?
Good question. So for the TOC finals, we had basically listened to a bunch of tape from MBA. We debated them a bunch, lost a whole bunch of times. Actually, more losses than wins, honestly. We recorded them. We wrote down literally every word that they said, and then we're like, okay. So it seems like every time that this team goes for topicality, they're very good at describing the impact to Clash and why Clash turns the K, but not very good at describing the violation itself. So then I was like, what might be the 2AC that really exploits that? And I was like, well, that might be a set of we meet arguments. And then I was like, if we're going to make a set of we meet arguments that are creative, how might I phrase this set of 1AC arguments? I'm like, okay, so maybe I might make a set of arguments about code switching that allows us to sort of have sort of that, line of it's kind of a planless affirmative, but it's kind of not, and still be able to persuasively articulate in the 2AR that perhaps it wasn't planned. Right, so that was sort of like the process. Or another, set might be if you're debating a set of teams that really likes to read psychoanalysis, you might be like, okay, what are some of the best cards that I've seen on this subject that psychoanalysis is wrong? And then be like, oh, they tend to be delusions. It's like, it sounds good. Then I might be like, okay, so this is my ideal 2AR. These are the cards that I might include in the 2AC. And then what affirmative do I think would fit the most with the set of cards that I'm about to read? And then I would write the affirmative in that way. Does that sort of make sense? So it's like, you want to sort of always think about like, what is the best quality 2AR and thus 2AC that you can read? And then be like, what 1AC fits this idea the most? Sometimes you have to think about more than one negative strategy though. So like MBA, for example, we were like, we think the two possible strategies for them are T and cap, which is exactly what they read. And we were like, okay, so we need to make sure that our affirmative doesn't just fold to cap if we wrote the 1AC. So that was like one consideration that went in. Or against, I guess we never broke our affirmative against North Star, but we were like, the set of negative positions that they read are arguments about body politics and pessimism. So I was like, okay, we need to find a set of articles that align the most to that 2R and then write the 1AC backwards from that.
This is a bit of a broad question, but what do you think is the best way to approach writing counter interpretations for the 2AC against T? And like, could you give some examples of 1ACs and how that affected the specific counter interp?
Good question. So I'd say that generally there's sort of like three main styles of counter-interpreting. One is to not counter-interpret the words of the resolution, but counter-interpret essentially the role of the affirmative. So this might be a set of questions that's like, the resolution's they're asking the wrong question, and we need to be asking a different question that allows for a different kind of debate. That set of arguments tends to be more focused on sort of the curricular benefits of expanding the question or asking a different question, and putting some of the sort of technical details of CJR on timeout. So, I think one example of this is the race war AF that we wrote was like not about immigration at all. We didn't find a card about immigration anywhere in the YC. I think there might be one card that said the word immigration, but it said nothing really about the topic itself. We were like, okay, the way that we might phrase that affirmative then, since it's not asking the question of CJR, is just, we should put questions of immigration, that was that topic, on timeout, and instead debate about the race war, which is something that is functionally more important. And that's the debates that should occur. So that's one way that you might write a counter. The second way that folks will write a counter interpretation is to sort of talk about sort of what certain embodiments might mean for different kind of topical action. So I think there's like two subsets to this. One might be a set of cards that's just like, there are a set of debaters that should not be forced to pursue things like procedure. So the most common counter interpretation here might be like, for example, Black debaters do not need to be topical, everybody else does, right? And they might make a set of arguments based on identity that's like, perhaps Black debaters have had a different set of experiences in relationship to debate that, hurt their ability to engage and really sort of change the way that it's accessible. And that might lead to that kind of counter interpretation where it's like, we don't really care what white people do or other people do in those debates, but Black debaters don't have to sort of follow some of those topical constraints, especially given that the topic community never really discusses sort of the issues that are important to Black folks, right? And the set of 1ACs that might be articulated based on that are probably a lot more identity focused. So they're less focused on sort of the structure of anti-Blackness per se, but they might be like, here are some personal experiences in relationship to, interpersonal interactions with the debate community, interpersonal interactions with the topic committee, that has birthed a set of consequences where it's like, okay, we should not be held responsible or accountable to a set of rules that we never agreed to begin with. Another version of this for this counter interpretation is to describe what it might mean to sort of, and this is less of a counter interpretation of the role of the affirmative and more a counter interpretation of the resolution. So perhaps, language is not something that is universally understood. There might be a bunch of different cultural ways that people might understand certain words. So I think this is one that like North Star did pretty well in that immigration topic in particular. They would make the argument essentially that the set of definitions that the negative has come up with are a bunch of expert definitions that are legal, jurisprudential even for the AT lab, that should not be sort of the locus for predictability, and that we should have sort of one that is determined culturally, that is more sensitive towards concerns of race and gender, right? And then, if that's the sort of set of affirmatives, right, you should have a set of apps that are like, the universal idea of CJR as such, as something that is not racist, et cetera, is something that should be criticized. And we need to have a more embodied approach to our politics. Similar to the last app, but I think those are sort of two different ways that you might pick counter interpretations. Now, the very last kind of counter interpretation is the set of people who basically just debated us like it's tea. So, they'll actually counter interpret all the words that you interpreted. So you were like, USFG means the government in DC. We said USFG is we the people. You said CJR is, reform based in the government. We say CJR is a larger set of concerns. You think policing is just law enforcement. We think policing is a lot broader and has a bunch of things. And those teams tend to make a set of arguments that are focused on sort of what is the curriculum that should be adopted. So the AF would likely be something like, we think we should discuss all these things about CJR. We should have sort of a limited version of the topic, and those are all productive discussions. But we should not sort of focus on just, top-down state-centric federal policy, and that might be sort of the affirmative that those counter-interpretations give rise to. And the thing to sort of think about those three different kinds of counter-interpretations is you want to sort of think about strategically, which counter-interpretation fits the best with the sets of arguments that people are making, right? So, let's say, one of the things I sort of realized with the MBA team in particular is that they were very good at answering impact rates. So the version where that was like, Black people don't have to be topical, like that was a non-starter coming out of like the MBA tournament, the Lexington tournament, the Emory tournament. So we were like, this is no longer a strategy that we could use really effectively in the TOC. So we were like, okay, so we would switch to a set of interpretations that was more like 2B, right? The interpretation that's like, oh, language is not all universal. Perhaps we have a set of arguments about how we should interpret words, and then focus on the set of we meet arguments instead, right? Or if for a fact that people are, really focused on a set of skills impact, it might make sense to pick counter-interpretation 3. That's like, well, we do have a set of skills that are based in the grassroots. That tend to be pretty important in relationship to CJR. Does that make sense? So it's like, it's always sort of a strategic calculation of what kind of counter-interpretation makes the most sense for the team that you're debating. And thinking about sort of like what people's strengths and weaknesses are is sort of a vital part of AF selection and like counter-interp selection.
Yeah, that helps a lot. Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Yeah. So I have a question on how one would respond to like the lived experiences argument without like seeming too overbearing or like not understanding, because like I don't want to sound like that, obviously.
That's fair. Do you mean like when you're negative and reading a topicality argument? Is that a fair?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think you can make a couple of arguments. You can make a set of arguments about limits that are like lived experiences functionally are different for everybody who lives. So for example, in the United States, that would mean there's millions and millions of different perspectives, right? It's not like all black people, for example, think the exact same thing about the topic. So it would be weird to be like, this is the only black lived experience version of interpreting these words. Like that doesn't seem true. Right. So, the fact that there's such a diversity of the number of lived experiences makes it very difficult to put together a negative strategy. If everybody's allowed to interpret whatever words in the way that they've lived those situations. Right. So that's sort of one way to talk about it. Another way to describe it is to make a set of arguments that's like, debating about lived experiences actually is psychologically harmful. So, let's say that I came up and was like, my experience with the police has been in relationship to, for example, the TSA, right? And I made a bunch of like personal narrative arguments. It's like that, to be negative against that is one that could be psychologically harmful, both for me in terms of, the negative team making a set of arguments because they have to disagree with you, right? They have to disagree with your lived experience that, perhaps, that leads to violent model of debate. Or, think about like if I made that set of arguments because I'm an Asian American and another Asian American was negative, it's like, do they have to refute that lived experience, right? It's like it creates sort of a model of debate that's perhaps harmful. So those are generally my go-to sets of arguments about lived experience that I think generally tend to be pretty useful too.
This is like, so sort of like what you were saying about like your offense against framework can't be like state bad, CJR bad. What are some examples of arguments are like intrinsic offense against framework for like planless affirmatives?
So, they just have to be like it's not CJR bad, but you've asked the wrong question. So there should not be questions about CJR good, bad at all, right? So, the pessimism one I think is the easiest one because it's like if you're asking the wrong question, like it literally has it in the card. It's like you can make a set of arguments that essentially is like we should not be discussing how to fix civil institutions, and the pros and cons of them. Those should never be discussed at all. That is sort of the larger intrinsic impact argument that you're making. Another way that people might make a set of impact turn arguments are less focused on the resolutional question, but they might just be like the idea of procedural exclusion might be bad altogether. So, I think for a while we had read like 2 years ago a wake work affirmative that essentially was just like the procedural exclusions that are placed by the debate community on the black community are bad. It does not really matter what the topic is at all. That's sort of the prior question that needs to be talked about. Lastly, you might have a set of arguments that's like, this is not the topic that we should talk about. We should be talking about a different style of topic. So, I think the race war F is a pretty good example of an intrinsic argument that's like, well, like we should not debate what, it does not matter whether immigration is good or bad, or whether people should get LPR. That is not a debate that we should be having. We should instead be having a debate about the race war, right? So it's like, those are sets of examples where it's like, you have a set of intrinsic arguments about debating the topic, not the content of the topic itself. Any other questions or any ideas you would like to pitch that you're thinking about and would like to get some feedback
on? This is less a question specific but to this thing, but if you aren't super familiar with critical literature and you wanted to perhaps write a critical affirmative, where do you think is the best place to start with research and just comprehension?
Well, I would probably start by, I think you got to sort of think about what is the thing that you sort of want to answer, right? So you want to start with what is the strategy component of it. So if you're a team that reads mostly policy arguments and you want sort of the KF in the back pocket, the reason why you might do that is because you're like, oh, this team is much better at debating things like process, but it's just terrible at debating framework. It just sounds really tone deaf when talking about fairness, right? There was like that question earlier that was like, how do I talk about lived experience in a way that's not like super harmful? It's like, yeah, there's definitely a set of debaters that are just awful at explaining all that stuff. And it's like, oh yeah, I'm going to keep a frame, a KF that's sort of focused and hones in on sort of that strategic weakness. So starting from that sort of strategic concept, then you might be like, okay, so given that I think that this team is not strategically very good at a set of arguments, it's like, what can I find in terms of the intersection between it, the CJR, the prison industrial complex, policing, et cetera, and what's sort of the larger critique that I can generate that says that sort of our current conception of CJR is too narrow. So it's not really like there's not really a formula per se that's like, you know, you dive in, but you generally want to be like, strategically, I feel like this is the thing they're bad at. What might be a thing that, you know, can talk about sort of that bad area, and then be like, okay, I'm now going to do research that's like specific to, you know, for example, pessimism and CJR, specific to queer theory and CJR, or whatever it is that your, you know, interest guides you with. The other thing is, you know, to write a KF, and this sort of dovetails what I just said, which is that you kind of need to be interested in the thing. It's the same way, like if you're writing a policy AF, if you're not interested in the thing that you're reading, you're not going to sound persuasive. So, you know, having some basic interest that's like, oh yeah, like I'm really interested in a set of gender issues, or I'm really interested in disability, or I'm really interested in Baudrillard, or whatever it is, right? It's like you have some curiosity, and having that curiosity to dive in will help you write the KF a lot easier. I'd also be happy to, like, if you end up deciding to write a KF, and you don't plan to, you know, obviously, you know, I coach in North Broward, full disclaimer, so it doesn't make sense to be like, hey, what do you think will be the best KF to read against North Broward? Because I'm just going to be like, yeah, read this one. It'll be great for us. If you'd like to ask about sort of like KFs and things that you're likely to read other people, I'd be happy to sort of give you like feedback, comments about strategy, things like that. So yeah, you can definitely use me as a resource even after camp about that. So.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great.
I think we have one final question, maybe time for that. And if not, we can move on to, you know, how to get into Dartmouth, which I think is the next optional webinar. Cool. I will take that to mean we feel pretty good. Well, thanks for coming. You know, enjoy your optional webinar or your time off.
Thanks for the lecture.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
Yep.